Well, I thought, guys, today I always like these talks to be pretty specific, and so I figured what I would do is just share with you a couple case studies, like one, Meraki, which was a business from '06 to 2015, and the second one, which is Meraki, which is a newer company, which is like a physical security company and cameras, and you guys even have some here, which is great. Actually, I think you have Meraki stuff too, in the back, yeah. So that's kind of what I figured I would talk about. I'd love to make it interactive, so lots of questions are great. I mean, I have slides, but I think questions are even better. And we'll try to go for about an hour, if that sounds good. Cool. So the talk, I think what Richie asked me to do is kind of go through sales stuff. So let me find a good way to do this. So I think the first case study we'll talk about is Meraki. So, sorry guys. So Meraki started off as and I won't spend a lot of time on the history, but Meraki started off as an MIT grad student project called RoofNet. And the goal was to make it super easy to deploy wireless mesh networks. In Cambridge, really, it started, and then said, hey, we can start a company based on this, and what we're going to do is we're going to make like a $50 Wi-Fi mesh access point, and we're going to let people set up networks in places where networks don't exist, perhaps outside the United States, and we're going to make money off billing services and other things in the future. And amazingly raised money with that concept. And by the way, this concept appears every 2 to 3 years. I get like someone's like, hey, we should really build a low-cost wireless mesh network, and it's gonna, like let you cover villages in India. It turns out it's pretty hard to make a good business out of it, but we did give it a shot. And after some time, and there's a lot of lag here, sorry. We said, hey, you know what? Too tough to make a business out of this. And we said, hey, we're going to go try something else. We tried building our own networks in San Francisco. There was briefly a network here called Free the Net. We tried to do it with ads, and eventually we're like, screw it, we're just going to go compete with Cisco. So that's actually what we did. And that actually ended up working out pretty well. We more or less said we're going to completely rethink how you manage these enterprise wireless networks. We didn't actually know a lot about enterprise wireless networks, but we were pretty sure that the products weren't very good because we knew people who were building them. And we just kind of dove in, built a straight up like wireless LAN competitor. And by the way, we didn't have a ton of like sales and marketing. Like we had a really good engineering team, but that part of it we all had to learn. And we decided to go after these like mid-market companies, mostly because we thought the enterprise stuff would be too hard, and we knew that the small guys probably wouldn't pay for like an commercial grade product. And the thesis was we're going to make it super easy to use, we're going to make it easy to deploy, we're going to make it feel really modern, as opposed to these like traditional systems, which were not at all like that, frequently command line based.
Can I
Yeah.
ask you what period of time you pivoted to this business?
Yeah, it was like year 3.
That is really important.
And like there was this sort of a half-hearted pivot in year 2.5, which was like ad-supported networks, but it didn't really work very well, so we killed that pretty quick.
What do you mean? That's important.
I think it's supposed to be over 3 years to be able to find that kind of product market fit.
Yeah, no, we were pretty sure the Sequoia guys were going to shoot us at some point. Yeah, I mean, I've observed a lot of folks, even if things aren't working, just won't change in a surprising way. I always assume from my experience at Meraki that, well, if it's just not working, you'll have to figure out something else. But a lot of times it's pretty hard to do. Certainly hard for us. So that leads me to the real purpose of this talk, which is talking about the sales piece of it. So we didn't start here, but I'll just kind of jump to where we ended up with for sales. Our basic recipe, which is every company's got its own recipe, was hire really good general purpose sales athletes, is what I'll call them. No real technological or technical like expertise required. Build a culture of success, which is really translates to like they're beating their quotas and they're making money. get rid of underperformers pretty quickly. So in the case of Meraki, that would be like 2 quarters. If you miss once, you're sort of on a plan. If you miss twice, we don't have a spot for you. And make the culture really fun for sales, which is really different from engineering. I mean, Meraki started off with a very engineering heavy, like the first 12 hires, like all engineering, heavy MIT influence, like hours were late, like start at 10 or 11, out of there by midnight, like these kinds of things. And then when we started hiring a lot of salespeople, there was just a completely separate culture, and we encouraged that. I mean, it felt like, on one side of the office, everyone's like quiet, headphones, like working, and the other side, like football getting thrown around. But that's okay, and that worked out well. And then, we also kind of kept an eye on how much the whole thing costs, because it can't get away from you. So I thought I'd like dive into some detail for like what these, and by the way, guys, feel free to jump in here. So, yeah.
Yeah, my question was basically after you guys decided to do the pivot to enterprise, how much sales did the founders do before hiring a single salesperson?
I think the conventional wisdom answer to that question is you should do a bunch right before you hire salespeople. We did not, primarily because we weren't going after like monster customers or big deals. We thought that we would be going after like mid-market, and so we were involved in a lot of transactions, but it wasn't the case where I thought we could like, we're gonna like do all the work for the first 6 months, land some big deals, and then we'll like repeat that. So we actually hired salespeople pretty quickly. We did end up firing most of them, actually. We hired like someone who, we hired someone, she, as a director, she went and hired like 6 people, and within a couple months it became clear that like that was not really the right like DNA, and so we had to turn over most of that team and like try again. The second time we did that, we actually were very involved in the hiring and like really kind of had to dial in the type of person that we wanted. So there was a reset there, but I think in the end it wasn't super expensive because we fixed it quickly.
How did you dial in?
So I had spent some time at EMC, and I'd also spent some time at VMware. And the cultures of those two companies were very different. And I observed that the EMC sales team was far more effective. So we basically like copied the EMC, what does that really mean? EMC was famous for like hiring half the Northeastern football team and like putting them through an inside sales program. Like half of them would make it, half of them wouldn't, and they would move out to the field. And they were really good at managing those people. And basically they would hire for like tenacity, energy, like street smarts, and that was sort of what we ended up copying, if that makes sense.
Is it like something internal?
Oh yeah, so inside sales in this case, yeah, she asked what's the inside sales program? I guess I'm distinguishing between people who are spending kind of the majority of their time selling on the phone versus in person in the field. Yeah.
How do you determine the quotas of the salespeople?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that there's no right answer. You probably just look at competitors if they exist and see sort of what they're doing, and then like take a discount off that as a reasonable like first approximation. Another way, and is just sort of like, well, if it were me, like what do I think I could reasonably do, and then like take a discount off that. And then the third lens I would look at is like, well, what's reasonable from a financial perspective? Like I'm always reluctant to end up in a situation like, say, Box, where your cost of sales like north of 100% of revenue. I think it's healthier to start like 50%. Just as a rule of thumb. And that's 50%, including all of the like extra costs like ramp and turnover and management and travel if you have that. So just pick something like reasonable. Amazingly, like I feel like when you pick a target, you sort of just end up hitting it. So like pick a target that you're sort of happy with, I guess is what I would say. So it's an art, not a science. I think even if you got it really wrong, it's not that hard to change it, either up or down. As long as you change it quickly. Like if your sales guys are starving, then you have to ask yourself, well, like debug that. Like, is it because the product's not there? Is it because like I hired bad salespeople? Is it because the quotas are unreasonable?
Maybe it's somewhat of a follow-up. But you mentioned your first team of salespeople weren't doing well.
Yeah, so I would say that. So I get to the office pretty early, like 5, 6, something like that. And I just remember getting there at 6. I'm the first guy there. Even the East Coast reps are rolling in at like 8. Then there's like coffee. Then there's messing around, and like they're not really doing anything till 9. If you're coming to the East Coast and you're not getting started till 9, that's noon. Like your day's half over. And so you see enough of that, and you're like, oh man, it's like totally not going to work. So I think I would generalize that by saying like you just have to keep an eye on it, and like really someone has to pay attention. So on the hiring side, and I think that's really the beginning. If you guys are ever in a position where you're like having to build a sales team, just like hiring engineers or anyone really, there's like great and good and like not so good, and like most people are in the not so good category. So you have to figure out like what kind of people you want and really get good ones. Took us a while to kind of zero in on this, but sort of a checklist is like reasonably long tenures in like a quota carrying position. You find a lot of people in sales like bounce around every 1 to 2 years. It's like pretty dangerous because that's usually because they're not doing well, even though there'll be like a great story about why, oh, the company got acquired, or oh, like my boss changed, or whatever. But like the reality is companies never fire good salespeople, like kind of ever, right? They're generating revenue. Your top 10% guys, like they're always going to have a job. So, be careful if people are jumping around a lot, except if you're hiring right out of undergrad, like, or 2 years out. That's a different story. And those people can be very good. Quantified sales versus quota. So like you can dig into the numbers. I mean, one nice thing about hiring salespeople is like your effectiveness is really managed. It's like measured by an integer, right? It's like kind of cool. So you can just look like, hey, what was your quota? Like how much did you make? And like now there's some legal, subtleties about like asking how much people make, but you can still kind of get at this information. And then just call back channel references. Like generally sales managers will pick up the phone and they'll like, hey, like, Susie used to work for you. Like, what do you think about Susie? And like, you can usually get an answer. So in my experience, if you get those 3 things, people that don't bounce around too much, that actually like beat their quota, and where you can get someone to vouch for them, like the hit rate will be very high if you can get those 3. Usually you can't get all 3 of those things, but if you can, that's like the ideal. What doesn't matter, at least in the Meraki case, was like any kind of like networking sales experience. It's like you could learn it pretty fast. And then also you can also go outside the normal envelope of like even like technology industry sales hiring. At least with Meraki, we were able to do that. And what we learned was that you'd rather have the top 5% person from like a copier sales company than like the top 30% person from Salesforce. So, and those people are easier to get because they're not being recruited as heavily. Like, these days with LinkedIn, right? Like what do recruiters do? They want to boil down a search into a like structured query in like the LinkedIn database, right? But like there's no field for is awesome or whatever. So you have to, especially when you're early stage and you don't have a track record and you're trying to attract good salespeople, it's often want to look where other people aren't looking. That's what I would say. Also gut feel, like we track this stuff pretty carefully. Like I learned over time that my gut's fairly bad versus like the more quantifiable stuff. So it's there, but it's not at like the top of the list. I have found that like sales managers will definitely make that number 1. Like, do I like this person? Do I intuitively believe they're a good salesperson? I'm not convinced that that's necessarily correct, that they're right about that. And then some complications here, like back channels are hard to get. It just takes a lot of time. You gotta like call around. And people won't do it over email generally. Recruiter incentives, like if you work with a recruiting talent agency, I mean, this is true for any role, but like they want to sell you the candidate, right? So you can't let them screen them for you, really. A lot of times, at least we hired younger reps, so limited work experience, so you don't get the track record effect. Or, the person is younger and they've spent 4 years at a company they've been promoted, which is like great, but like you can't call, because they're going to blow them up if they still work there. So anyway, some complications, you can work through it, but I think the overall, like, sense I would want to give you is that it does take a lot of work and you got to think through like what's my special sauce here and like evolve that over time. That makes sense. Yeah, cool. So if it's working, then you get into the like, how do I find enough of these people? And I think that is like when you're running an enterprise business, if you can get to the stage where you picked a market that's big enough, and now you can hire a salesperson for $150,000 a year, and you can give them a quota of $1 million a year, and it with a very high probability that works. Well, like that's awesome, right? Because when you get that, you just want to like do it more and more and more. I mean and so at Meraki especially, we were always like searching for reps and like trying to find creative ways to get them, and it became the scale limiting factor. Not like leads, not verticals, just like can we literally hire enough people to do it? High quality people. So like here's an area where I think you can get really creative. I think the happy hours that we did like have been cloned a lot. Well, yeah, a lot of people are doing them. I don't know if they cloned them, but like the insight there was you could get people to show up for a happy hour that wouldn't interview otherwise because it's like a baby step. I was like, well, I know you're not looking, but we're having like a happy hour at a cool bar. You should come. And then that turns into that's like half a step, and then the next thing you know, they're interviewing. In-house recruiters, like we definitely use them a lot. They are hard to find. I think the problem you have with recruiters is if they're really good, they want to work in an agency because they make a lot more money. So finding ones that are earlier on in their career or for some other reason don't want to work in an agency is like the key. And then internal referrals were really the best. But we found that, well, if you have, so depending on what you do with the inbound, right? So if they get the inbound, then it's a little harder to tell. If they don't get the inbound, then I think you just like strap a number on them and be like, okay, offers, I think is the better metric. I think hires is not fair because, they're not really responsible for selling the candidates, or at least I don't think they should be. But offers, is like a little. If the candidate doesn't say yes, it's kind of like not the recruiter's fault, I think. Offers isn't perfect either, but I think it's the best. And then you just have to pick a metric. I would say that putting them on a variable compensation plan, I have not had luck with that. Kind of too intense, and they're like selling the candidates too hard. I think with an in-house recruiter, they will spend a lot of their time lobbying like the hiring manager to get the person hired, and you kind of don't really want, they're always gonna be some of that, but you don't want it so that like they're so incentivized that they'll be like, yeah, I'll spend half my time sourcing and half my time like trying to convince you that this is the right candidate because that's how I get paid. So there is some trickiness, I think, to managing that function. But I think the hardest part about it is finding the good recruiters. So yeah, putting a number on it, and if they get the inbound, it's trickier, right? Because then it's like, well,
Is there a way to tell in advance? Or is it just
I don't think so.
hire someone?
I think you hire them, and yeah, I've tried many times to get like top agency recruiters to come work at a company, whether that's like a company I'm involved in or board or something, and like it's really hard to get them to move because they can make like $300,000 to $500,000, and like very few companies are going to pay that much. I think you probably just, the question is how do you determine the number of hires for a recruiter? I think it ends up being like 3 to 6 per quarter-ish. Another way you could back into that is like, well, how much am I going to pay an agency? So if I'm hiring like $200,000 people, then I'm probably paying an agency 20%, that's $40,000 each, and back into it that way. Presumably the recruiter will be cheaper than using outside agencies. But I think like 10 a quarter sounds pretty high, 2 sounds low. I don't know, somewhere in there. You can kind of guess and see how they do. Any other questions on this? So anyway, hiring them is hard, and especially at scale. So one, yeah.
So when you think about hiring like early salespeople, so like you're the first salesperson, like what are your thoughts on where to look for in terms of the experience profile and
Yeah.
how to build that?
So I think it probably depends a little bit on what you're selling. If it's like a complex enterprise sale, say like you think it's going to be like 500 and multi-million-dollar deals, that's one category of person. If it's less than that, then different. I'll call that inside versus like field, even though that might not be actually what you, but you know, I think inside early stage, I think probably the best bet is to look for people that are relatively early in their career but have had some success versus say like a career inside salesperson. Hire multiple of them at once because that way you get some contrast. If you hire one and it doesn't work, you're like, well, like, I don't know, it could be like 4 different reasons why it's not working. But if you hire 3 of them and that would give you more confidence if they're all not working that there's something else wrong. It's also possible you hired 3 duds, but like it's less likely. So I think it's good to have contrast. I'll talk about this later in the Meraki section, but like that's what we did there. So we just hired 2. We hired 2 known good, right? So if you can hire known good, then that just removes the quality of the salesperson from the equation. Then you can worry about like whether your product is any good or things like that. So one thing, and again, I know most of you are super early, but as you move along, like one way to also get salespeople is to hire them as like sales development reps or some other like non-quota carrying role, and then try to like create a farm team. So you like pick the best ones, move them up, and like move the rest of them out. So Meraki created a program called Ignite, which you had to do in like 30 to 60 days. You had to like complete a bunch of objectives, and like it was a filtering mechanism. Can be a little hard to sell this program, like if someone's leaving a job and you're like, well, you might not make it after 60 days, but you can still do it. Yeah, so what I thought it was going to be when initially we did it was going to be like, it's going to measure like work ethic and tenacity, like basically like cold call for leads. And it ended up that was not actually what was the biggest determinant. The biggest determinant was like, could you follow instructions and did you like show up to work on time? It's like, seems pretty basic, but like you could weed out a lot of people like on the, you know, and it didn't end up being nearly as like quantitative as I thought. The guy who was running it for me, we were like ready to go all Moneyball on this, like, you know, stats, and it was like far more basic than that ended up being like predictive. And like people would show up and they were like, because we hired like questionable people into this, and people would like, you do like a day of training and you'd be like, okay, tonight your homework is to like go learn how to do a demo, and they just like wouldn't do it. And you'd be like, huh, all right, well, like that's a pretty easy, like I'm glad I didn't hire you as a salesperson because it would have taken me like, it would have been way more expensive and painful to like weed you out. So, yeah.
Sorry, just for context, what were the average deal sizes?
For Meraki, so it changed over time, but in the early days, so average is a little bit of a misleading number. I'd say average is like 5 to 8K. But there were a lot of small transactions that took no time that would weigh the average down. And so what really was going on is that people were spending their time on like 20K deals. And if it was like less than that, they kind of like, maybe they throw you a quote, but like not really spend time. Yeah.
So even the Ignite program was even for the reps who were coming with experience?
If we were not sure about you, actually we did it 2 different ways. At one point it was if we weren't sure about you, and another point we just made everyone do it. So, yeah.
I'm just curious, how did you convince someone who has a track record, who has experience selling deals of that size, that they have to go through this?
Then, you know, in that case, we'd frame it more as like, look, you know, you have to do it, it's part of the thing, but like you'll get through it fast. Like if you're, you know, we did have you could get through it in like less time if you were particularly like efficient. So you just like call it a training program.
And so this is cheaper than hiring a sales rep. Obviously, you're assuming
Well, it's cheaper than making a mistake. That's all. Yeah.
because you have to wait 2 quarters.
Yeah.
Given that you guys weren't doing sales yourselves, the founders or your team, who was teaching these sales guys how to do sales?
Oh no, yeah. So we were definitely. I mean, when I say doing sales, I guess what I meant by that was we didn't do it all by ourselves and had no other salespeople. We were definitely involved in like every step of the process, closing, like qualifying. I mean, we were like super involved. And when I say we, me and my partner, there was one other partner who was a CTO. He had nothing to do with it, but the 2 of us.
And was it sort of like a cookie cutter pitch that each salesperson was taught, or was it sort of
Uh, yeah, well, a little bit of both. We would teach you what we thought was the best pitch, but we're fine if you like deviated from the script, because certainly there's like a sort of an evolutionary quality to these things where, you know, you want some like genetic diversity, so you like discover new like tricks and tactics. So in the Meraki case, definitely not like a, oh, it's the first call, here's a script, here's a second call, here's a script. Like, yeah, it was more like learn how to do a demo and do it well, and also like practice objection handling questions, but not really scripted. Obviously that depends on the type of thing you're selling. If you're selling like I don't know, like super repeatable, like 2 calls to close, like it could be a lot more scripted. Meraki stuff was a little more complicated than that. And then, you know, I think you can do fun things with like instrumenting sales. Like these are leaderboards, and leaderboards can be done in a way that I think people find them very oppressive if they're sort of like shaming you, or they can be done in a fun way. And I think things like this make a difference. And you know, we had leaderboards all over the place. We run little contests, and people's picture were up there, and we'd have like, you know, top rep like for the West Coast. You know, just like run little things like this.
If they were top rep?
Well, so not money bonuses, although obviously the top rep you had the most commission since it's done on a percentage basis. But we did introduce something called like a club trip, you know, which is I think pretty common in sales land, where the top X either percent or X people get some like fancy vacation, and like the management team comes and the top salespeople go. I think that's a good thing to introduce when you have like 10 to 20 reps. Some companies like will do it where like if you beat quota you get to go, and some companies will be like, no, you really have to be like X top, you know, like top 5% or something like that.
Do you guys do spiffs or?
Not really, no. I've found spiffs to be too complicated. Usually, marketing people always want to run spiffs, but I think that the best sales comp plans are very simple. It's like you want the rep to be able to do the math in their head. Like if I sell $100,000, my commission rate is 10%, I make $10,000. I've definitely seen comp plans that are like points based, and that usually arises because like there's like multiple people in the room deciding what's important. I mean, one person will be like, well, I want logos, another person says, well, but we need the top line, another person's like, yeah, but what about profitability? And you just end up with some like, you know, Frankenstein thing. Like I would really make sure that you can completely describe the comp plan in one sentence.
So you wouldn't set up your comp plan so that there are metrics that are intermediate or preceding metrics to the sale?
No, I would definitely not do that. I mean, I'm sure there's some case where you want to do that, but like dollars, like booked, and a percentage. It's like, oh, I can't really imagine too many cases where you don't want to do that. Maybe the VP sales like gets a profitability goal or something, but it's so hard to hit the top line. You just want all effort, you know, in that direction. And you can like, you know, if you have discounting issues, you can solve that through like rules. If you have like concerns about them not getting enough meetings or things like that, well then, like that's gonna fall out in the top line anyway. And it, you know, I think you could have an issue there if you gave someone like an annual comp plan. And, you know, then you're really worried because like you're not going to really know for a year. So like probably don't do an annual comp plan. Even for longer sales cycle products, I think you can still like, okay, the first 3 months your quota is 0, but the next 3 months I want to see like $50,000 paid POCs or something like that. Yeah.
What about equity compensation?
For sales, low. Because you want them making all their money off commission. I mean, different for management, but for the individual rep.
Have you seen any company trying to challenge that?
I can't think of any. I mean, I'm not saying it's a horrible idea. I haven't done it that way. Like equity for like compensation, variable compensation. I don't know. I mean, I feel like most salespeople really like want the money. You know. Like, and you sort of want, I mean, like most salespeople, frankly, like if they make $100,000, like they're gonna go buy like a BMW M5, and like that's fine because then they need to make another 100,000. Like these aren't, it's a very different philosophy than like, oh, I made 100,000, like now I can, put 25 in like my Roth 401k and like, like no. Like, yeah. So yeah, yeah. Yeah, and you just got to get into that. So I thought I'd talk a little bit about channel, like an example, since I don't know. Are you guys are any of you guys gonna have to deal with channels? Maybe no. Yeah. So the idea of a channel is it's a third-party company, a reseller, sometimes called systems integrators or VARs or whatever. And the idea is like you're gonna sell to them, and then they're gonna sell your product to the end customer. And frequently this comes up in like a board meeting where someone says like, hey, our sales are really expensive, we should go through the channel. And you're like, oh, what does that mean? Anyway, it's very complicated is what I would say. It frequently doesn't work. Meraki did make it work, we had to make it work, but don't underestimate the challenge of it. I'll tell you this story because we also got this advice, oh, you guys should sell to the channel. Okay, we hired a channel manager. He went up and signed up resellers, and we gave him a goal of like sign up X resellers, and we thought we were doing great because in the first quarter he signed up like 100 resellers. One of them was this, as advertised to us, like great, amazing victory. We convinced Sentinel Technologies, which is a big Cisco partner in Chicago, like probably 100 million, to carry our product. And the CEO loved it. We went and trained the CEO, trained the salespeople, trained the SEs, sent a product manager. And then like nothing happened. And this is like very typical. For many reasons, I won't get into them all, but basically like in the early stages where you don't have customers asking for your product and you don't have the channel will not sell your product. They are a fulfillment mechanism, not a lead generation mechanism. And that's like really important to understand because you might think that you're doing great by signing up all these partners and all you have to do is enable and train them, but like I've never actually seen that work, and I've tried. Really what you have to do is like go take their customers from them, and then they will be interested in selling your product because like, it's like, oh yeah, that deal thought we were gonna win, like you guys won it. Like, so what do you guys do again? Like that's sort of how it ends up working.
How do you go about doing that? Do you actually try to target a customer?
You go after the end customers. Yeah, even if it's a channel-driven business, like most SaaS products, like CRM, or they're not really channel products, but like networking is definitely typically sold through channels. Physical security is. So
actually, even Dropbox had a
channel program.
Yeah, had
Was
a
it
channel
material
program.
to the revenue?
It didn't work.
Yeah, it's really hard to get it to work. Yeah. I mean, like EMC had a channel program. From the CEO on down, they didn't like the channel, so the channel was always this like appendage, and EMC just sold direct because they were selling data center equipment and it was big deals, and they didn't really need a channel.
I also think that a simpler explanation of channel would just be that there are these sellers of software, and like if you can align yourself, like they might be selling SaaS products, CRM products, networking products, data storage products, and if you can align yourselves with them in that, like you're adding a service that the end customer might need, then they will resell your product as well. In addition to that, and then they take a cut of what they're selling. Yep. But like Hans said, it's very difficult to get them to do lead gen for you, unless like you start taking some percentage of their customers and then they feel like, oh, there is a demand for your product, in which case they kind of like are able to connect the dots for you.
What's lead gen?
Lead generation, like finding deals, prospecting.
I see.
Yeah.
It's like sourcing.
Yeah.
Did you typically pass on the reseller percentage back to the customer, or would you follow that?
We would just get the question was, would you pass on the margin you would have given to the reseller to the end customer? And I guess I never really thought of it that way. I think you just try to get as much money as you possibly can, but also win. However that ends up working. Yeah.
Hans, sorry,
Yeah.
I have a question for you.
Yeah.
Like, sure, like you may have found product market fit with Meraki that you might have verified before hiring your first couple of salespeople. But did you have like a sales trick or a distribution trick? Like after all, you were competing with Cisco. Like that was no small shakes. Like
Yeah.
what was your, like did you have like some sort of unique insight, some sort of unique lead gen mechanism, or was it just like brute force, hire a sales team to sell your product?
Yeah, I mean, I guess like rapid experimentation. I mean, I'll give you the general answer, which is like try this, try this, try this, try this, like see what works, and then evolve accordingly. What ended up working well was so top of funnel marketing. We figured out that we could email people who were like IT directors and networking people, invite them to a webinar, give away a free access point, which had a list price of about $1,000, but a cost to us around $100 if you attended the webinar. If you gave away the access point, your attendance rates went like 10x versus not. So we get tons of people to like show up at a webinar that way, and then we could follow up aggressively on those webinar leads and like therefore get end customers. That's the result of like 6 months of like super rapid experimentation. I mean, that's like, and that's super specific to Meraki. Like you can't go do that for like whatever, you guys are doing. But also you can't like Google it on the internet or hear about it. You have to just like try many experiments and find a system that works for you.
So I thought that channel sales was a big, was like a big avenue of sales for you guys.
Yeah, so what we did with the channel was first we sort of tried what I said here, like sign up X partners, train X partners, like have them sell. That like totally didn't work. So we just went after the end customers instead, but we fulfilled the product through the channel. So like in the case of Meraki, we would like, let's say find, Palo Alto Unified School District. We'd convince the director of networking at Palo Alto Unified School District to buy Meraki for his like network refresh. And they would say like, who do you want to buy that from? Because we only sell through the channel. And he'd say, well, I usually buy my networking from whatever, Bear Data. And then we would say like, well, can you make an introduction to Bear Data and we'll see if we can do business with them. And then we'd say, hey, Bear Data, we've got a deal. Do you guys want it? We'll give you 10 points on that deal. And the Bear Data guys would probably say, oh yeah, sure. Yeah, we'll take that. And then like, that's how you would actually fulfill it.
But why would you fulfill through a channel partner instead of doing it directly?
This is the channel is like a whole, I think there's a whole like, deep discussion there. But I say it is very hard to run a sales, in my experience, it's really hard to run a sales organization where sometimes you go direct and sometimes you go through the channel, because the channel will like hate you for it. And they will always suspect that the deal they gave you took direct to cut them out and to save like 10%. So I think it's much easier to always take stuff through the channel, even if it's less efficient in the beginning. I think people would disagree with me on that. Like certainly like EMC would just say, like if we can't take it direct, we will. But then again, EMC is not a channel driven, like EMC, the channel could go away and they'd like sell 80% as much. So they're just not core.
So can you tell me with Meraki, like what percentage you fulfilled yourselves versus got fulfilled by channel partner?
0% ourselves.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
We would always take it through.
So your sales team was just lead gen?
No. We do all the work. And then at the very end, we'd be like, who do you want to buy that from?
Why would you do that?
Because you're priming the pump. You're saying like, look, eventually I'm going to get these people to bring me a lot of business. Yeah. So now, like the way Meraki sales works is like they call up their channel partners and they're like, hey, what do you got for me? Which is sort of like the end state, I would say. But in like, say the 2014 timeframe, channel probably sourced like 40 to 60%. And some of it, much of it was zero touch. Like literally a PO would just show up and we didn't have to do anything. But to get to that point, you really have to do the work.
Are the end customers asking for Meraki and that's why the reseller is coming to you? Or because you've sold so many times to their customers, they're now like, we'll just position this first?
Yeah, both. Both cases. Yeah. Let me skip over some of the channel stuff because it is a jungle. And I guess what I would say is that if you end up in a business where channels matter, just be prepared for like a lot of work. It's fine. I mean, you can get through it, but I think a lot of startups will not do that and they will not figure it out. And that may be okay if you're selling a SaaS product, because in general, SaaS products don't go through channels. Yeah, it's complicated for sure. I'm gonna skip this slide. I'll talk briefly about international, but I think it's early for you guys. If you do end up doing international, I would highly recommend you send known good salespeople rather than hire in-country to start with, because you almost certainly will make many more hiring mistakes if you like go to, I don't know, Latvia and you try to hire like Latvian salespeople. Like, it's crazy. You're not gonna be able to do that. Even the UK, we couldn't really do that. I'm gonna skip over some of this. So the other thing I think with running a sales organization, yeah.
So can I get tricky? At what point and what did it feel like when you hit product market fit? I mean, you obviously discovered it. What was it? Was the floor sucked out from under you?
No, I guess I don't remember that point exactly. I just remember having like a revenue plan and trying to like hit the revenue plan as much as possible.
I guess maybe another way to ask the same question, but like, is there a litmus test, not necessarily specific to Meraki, but just in general, where you're like, this is the litmus test I use to know if you're ready for your first sales hire?
For your first sales hire. Yeah. Right. Well, I mean, how I would do it is like, well, let's say we're at the point where we're hiring salespeople and we've got 2. And you said, all right, because I've spent enough time in this market and selling the product and so forth, I think that these people should be able to sell $50,000 each in the first 3 months. And then you try like everything to get them to hit that goal. And the goal after that is like 150 or whatever it is, ARR, MRR, however you want to do it, right? And then once it really looks like they're gonna beat the goals you set out for them, then you just like hire 2 more and see if it's repeatable. That's sort of my like experimental way that I would do it. Rather than a more like qualitative, like, do I have product market fit? There's probably like instances where you're like, aha, I got it. But I feel like just going out there and doing it might be a good way to go as well. I would say there are lots of small things which should not be overlooked. It would be good if someone in your company, like perhaps not you or the founder or whatever, but like there's a lot of small stuff that does matter. And I think a well-run sales organization, I underestimated how important that would be. We hired a sales operations person at Meraki when we had 6 reps, and I thought it was like extremely extravagant. This was like a director. They cost $180,000. I was like, why don't we just hire another rep? Like, why do I want a sales operations person? And that was incorrect. Sales operations is really worthwhile because they're a force multiplier for everybody else. So keeping Salesforce organized, cleanly defined territories, compensation plans that are like always accurate. Sales guys aren't wondering like, how did finance arrive at the paycheck number? Like, it's all clear. So that is worth something. Again, it's not like 2 salespeople, but if it's 20, you probably waited too long. So Meraki ended up expanding its product line, started wireless, did switching and routing and security, a few other things, and ended up basically doubling to tripling per year. And this isn't, super relevant, but that's kind of where things landed. I did want to touch briefly on how much does it cost to make a mistake? And I think that intuitively, you're going to arrive at a smaller number than the actual cost. So like in the Meraki sales model, it's a territory-based model, right? So like if you start as a salesperson, you might get Ohio, right? And it's going to take us like 2 to 3 quarters to figure out whether you're like pretty good. And so if you look, this is small text, but if you pick right, the pick right scenario, this is like the revenue that you would generate, like 30, 150, 200, and after like 2 years, you would generate 1.4 million. If we picked wrong and you sort of like missed the first quarter, missed the second quarter, third quarter, you're gone, we had to find a replacement, and then the new person came and they ramped up and they were successful, after 2 years they generated $840,000. It's like $500,000. And for field sales, where all these numbers are bigger, it's like million plus. It's actually pretty expensive. And so when you really internalize that, you're like, huh, yeah, it's pretty expensive when I make mistakes. That then leads you to like really want to be careful about sales hiring and like getting back to what we talked about originally, which was like back channel references and making sure, because it can be quite expensive. And it's not the salary cost, it's the opportunity cost if they would have been successful. If that makes sense.
Does your Ignite program kind of partially reduce this? If you put more people through the funnel?
Which
So, like,
paradigm?
You said that you had this Ignite program before.
Yeah. It's designed to reduce mistakes.
What for the field salespeople, what are the attributes that you look for?
Similar, but just generally they're about double to triple the cost for their all-in, right? So like a field salesperson in software right now, I would say like 250 to 300 OTE. Plus, if it's a technical product, some kind of sales engineer, that person's like 150 to 200, plus travel. So you have like maybe an SDR, depending on how your model works. So like field teams generally cost like 500 to 700 a year all in. And so as a result, their quota needs to be like 2 to 3 million. You're probably not doing field sales until you're like raised to Series A. And like, I would say also field sales are trickier. Like if you haven't dealt with sales before, they're harder to make. They're not here. They're in like New York, and like you don't know what they're doing, and they're harder to manage. So if you can stay away from field sales, like if you haven't done this before, like I would. Inside's way easier. I mean, they're like literally at your office. You can hear the conversations. They cost less. So Meraki cost of sale, these are sort of interesting numbers. At sort of scale, 23% inside, 40% field. Those are very good numbers. I think if you're running around 50%, you should be happy. And that's also scaled numbers. I'm going to skip the post-Cisco stuff. Talk a little bit about Verkada, which is a company that I co-founded a few years ago with 3 other people. And we make cloud-managed security cameras, like the ones you guys have in the office. Similar to Meraki in that it's like a cloud-managed widget, et cetera, but different in many other regards. And since this is more recent, I thought it would be interesting because it's younger. So I won't talk too much about the product, but basically the way that cameras generally work is you take a camera, you cable it up either via coax or Cat5 to like a Windows box that's called a network video recorder. That thing is then managed by like Windows software or maybe like a monitor, dedicated monitor, and that's how these things work. The Verkada one is like the one that I'm sure if any of you thought about it for very long, the way you would build it, which is like, well, I'm gonna like take a camera, I'm gonna like connect it to the internet, and I'm gonna like manage it with a browser. Okay, so it seems like, well, isn't this what Nest did or Dropcam like a long time ago? Yes, but enterprise cameras turned out to be a pretty tricky business, and there's been a lot of like venture-backed smoking creators. So that was the state of the thing, and we were like, well, we're gonna try it anyway. And it's done well. I don't know why I have the slide in here, but and this is sort of the timeline. So we founded it in May, beta customers in the fall, so it's about a year and a half later. We launched it in the winter, so a couple months after the beta, with 2 salespeople. We hired 2 known good, like people I'd worked with before. I knew they were very good. One of them had to leave for non-performance related reasons, and we just replaced them. But we had 2. We gave them like pretty modest goals, I think 50,000 first quarter. And they beat it by a decent amount. And we're like, well, let's see how we do the second quarter. I think it was like 125. They also did well. We're like, okay, this seems to be working. Hire 2 more. And then we actually got 3 because we found another one that was sort of opportunistic. And then we like watched that cohort go. And that seemed to be working. And so like, then you're in like, okay, it seems to be working, and kind of grow at a 2x kind of rate. I think we got pretty lucky. Also, I've done it before, so it's a little easier, but that was sort of like the early, stage process. Then you also have a marketing person. And there's always this question. It's like, well, what are the sales guys really doing? Are they converting leads that they get from like someplace and they're the like lead to dollar converter machines? Or, is that not how it works? And I've done the like converter machine model a few times. I find it very stressful because now there's like two people responsible. There's like the marketing guy and the sales guy. I think it's way better if you just say, look, salespeople, the marketing people, they do the website. Like, that's about all we can expect, right? So you got to make it happen. And then you tell the marketing people, hey, like you need to generate X number of sales qualified leads per quarter. That's your goal, or per month, or whatever it is. Like, don't let us down. But you don't let the sales people and the marketing people like do this because it always happens, or at least it always happens to me. So we had a marketing person. They were doing okay, generating some leads. Definitely not nearly 100% of what we needed. So the salespeople actually got pretty good at prospecting. Makes sense. There were a lot of questions, and this is, again, I'm sure you guys have your own questions, but I'll tell you some of the questions for like a Verkada business. Like, the channel is actually very powerful. So like opposite of SaaS. Like in the physical security business, most people don't even know like whose stuff they have. They're like, oh, I buy my security system from like ADT or like Joe's like security services, and you have no idea like what Joe installed in your business. Like, is it Axis cameras? Is it Hikvision? Like, you don't even know. So historically, the channel has been like extremely powerful. If you ask VCs about this business, I think they will tell you, oh, like, yeah, channel, like scary. Also, it's a channel that we knew nothing about. It's a completely parallel universe to the networking channel. Not the same people. The people that sell cameras are definitely not the same people that sell you like your networking or your phones or like whatever else you might buy. We didn't know anyone. We heard they had like really high margin requirements. We didn't know who the end customer is. So with cameras, it's like, well, sometimes it's IT, but not usually. It's like facilities. In the case of retail, there's this group called loss prevention, which is like, what you think, like keep people from stealing stuff. And it's like fragmented. So unlike, say, if you're selling CRM software, like who's the customer? It's the VP sales, right? Like for sure. For this, it was like sort of unclear. And also it was unclear if customers would actually rip this stuff out. It lasts a long time. Like sometimes you look at these cameras in stores and it's like, this feels like it's 20 years old. Like maybe no one's gonna replace this stuff. So there's like a bunch of unknowns. So we took our best guess and more or less just started selling it, see what happens. I think that's a reasonable approach. You got a lot of questions. I think to answer these questions for VCs is very different to answer them from yourself. I think, like for sure, the Verkada business, this was a hard to venture fund company because a lot of people lost a lot of money in this area. So there's all these like questions, and I think the way to really like get to the bottom of this is to do it. So actually the venture reaction to this business was like highly negative before traction and highly positive after traction. I guess that's like always true, but even more than normal, I would say. Yeah. So this is sort of what we put together very concretely. I think, this is more like, I think for probably where a lot of you are like, what's your plan, right? So this is what we said. We like made it up, in an Excel model. We're like, we're gonna hire. So it was 2, but like I said, we had to like churn 1. But this was kind of our plan, like linear growth in reps, because it was pretty conservative. And then like basically we had a 9-month ramp in here. So like this person who starts in Q3 ends up being fully productive in Q2. And if you just like do the math with quotas, you end up at like the light blue bars, and it looked nice, but it looked doable. And then the solid blue is where we did. So we were beating the numbers, which caused us to basically say like, hey, we're gonna get a lot more aggressive on this number. And so actually where we ended here was like 38. Because around here, we're like, it's working. So we just like started adding more quickly. That makes sense.
Wait, so did you actually end the year with 6 million instead of like 3?
It's a confidential number. No, we the company did a lot, did quite a bit better than that. Yeah. This was the that was projected. Yeah. So I mentioned this, start with good reps. We talked about leads, talked about channel. Oh, there was an unexpected thing. So and again, sorry about the channel, but again, for this business is important. Our plan was find the customers and sell through the channel. We'd hired a few salespeople who came from like Okta and like the very much like don't like the channel type companies, and they just like refused to do it. And so we like ended up selling a lot direct. We had to turn that off. Really had to turn that off later because of the like channel will hate you if you sell direct problem. But they brought some of these like enterprise SaaS sales tactics to this business, which ended up being a pretty good way to get started. And that's one of those examples of flexibility. Like I was pretty sure that if we're going to go through channel, like we had to fulfill it, but the reps just like didn't want to do it. And I was like, all right, well, we'll see how that works, right? And it was pretty cool because they came up with tactics that you can't use, well, that you really only use for software. Like for example, instead of like waiting for a purchase order, they would just send a DocuSign and they're like, please sign this. And so it's a lot easier for a customer to like click the DocuSign and be like, I approve, than to like go to his finance department and say like, hey, here's a quote, please generate a PO. Like that takes a week. And probably like there'll be some fallout from doing that. So they're like very tactical things that you can do to speed things up. And then on the recruiting side, once we decided to ramp it up, some like new veins, I guess, of talents. Like we had a bunch of people who were local, like grew up in the area, and they just like knew a lot of other salespeople. So I think we have 20 from like Danville. Or not 20, but like 10, I mean a lot. And surprisingly little from like Meraki. We heard some, but not a ton. So anyway, I think with the recruiting, it's you got to be flexible, right? It's like, where can I find a vein? You know, schools, geographies, social networks, like wherever you can get it. But that ended up being important in this one. Yeah, that's how we actually did versus a revised up plan. So great bunch. That's what I got. Almost exactly an hour. Do we have time for any more questions, or are we? Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
So I'm coming at this from like a product perspective. Can you talk about like, you've talked like very little about like what your actual products have been throughout this process. How much does like the actual product matter, and how much is just like great salespeople will sell anything to anyone?
Well, I think the product matters a ton. Like, you got to have an amazing product. That's like the starting point. I think, I guess the point I would make is that it is the necessary but not sufficient. You know, like, yeah, you got to have an amazing product that people actually want. That's like better than what else is out there. Once you have that, if you're selling to businesses, generally you then also have to go through all this to get it to work.
In the earliest days, when you were trying to figure out how much to price these big enterprise contracts, what did you do to figure that out?
Well, I guess that depends on whether there is an equivalent product in the market. If there is, like, I don't know, whatever is there in your case, is there like an equivalent thing? Yeah, so I think most entrepreneurs' initial instinct is to make it cheaper than what else is out there. Sometimes right, but frequently not right. Really, you want to like price it based on value and see if you can sell it. So like in the case of cameras, for example, it's pretty easy because there's like 1 million comps out there. And philosophically, we're like, well, we're better, but we'll probably price it about the same. And then we will discount to meet the price needed for a specific deal. Because like there's like list price, right? And then a lot of times in enterprise, like, oh, like where it actually lands is like super deal specific. And if you plotted it, you would see like distributions on discounts all over the place. And I think that is a totally reasonable thing to do, to have massive discount variation in the early days. You know, you're like, I don't know, if you're selling $1 million thing, you're like, customer's like, how much did you say? $1 million? And he's like, oh no, like, nah, and possibly you're like, all right, well, like 700,000. I mean, you can kind of like come down. And I think that's You can even do that when it's pretty cheap products. Like even $20,000, if you have good reps, you can still like basically like use human intelligence to like discover the elasticity of demand for that particular deal.
So it sounds like your inside sales teams have always been local. Have you explored or have you built inside sales teams? In
Yeah, everyone
Utah
always
or other
asks about
markets?
that. I strongly believe in local. I think it is, you know, you go to Salt Lake, you go to Atlanta, you go to wherever, you'll get salespeople for like 50 to 60 to 70% of the price. But your ability to manage them is like 5x less. And I think when you're in that learning, like discovering phase, it is so important that you are close. I think it's a false economy. Now, okay, you've got 500 salespeople, you're like tapping out the SF market, you can't get in enough people, your whole machine is like humming, and you're like, now I'm gonna transplant the machine to like Austin or wherever, like that's different. But in the early stages, I think really worthwhile. And also, if someone says like, well, we can't hire people in San Francisco, I think that's kind of like if you're single and you're like, well, I can't find any, you know, girlfriends or boyfriends in San Francisco, so I'm moving to New York. You're like, well, it's probably you, you know. So I kind of think it's like that. If you can't find anyone, if you can't hire like 5 people of any kind in San Francisco, like it's not San Francisco, it's you know. So yeah, I would, you know, people will disagree. Like I, you know, there are definitely people who don't feel that way, but I think having everyone in the same office is like really invaluable.
Sorry, one other question. What have you seen as like the threshold between like your inside sales reps kind of average or max deal size with your field rep?
Yeah, I think it varies a ton. So like Verkada's case, we closed a $1.2 million deal, never met the customer over the phone. In networking, that would have never happened. Like networking, like we'd have to get on a plane for like 100,000, 200,000. So it's like really a lot of variance. I think it's very specific to your business. I think what you should do is have some like dollar value where you're willing to like travel, and put that dollar value pretty low in the beginning. Like I definitely took trips to like Florida and all sorts of places for like $100,000 deals in like the Meraki 2009, 2010 timeframe. And then like you'll learn like, okay, did I really need to show up? Did I not need to show up? And you kind of like learn that process. I don't think there's a fixed. I would, like I was talking about earlier, you know, if you can avoid hiring the field salespeople or put it off a little until you really know what you're doing, I think it's likely to save you money. But some businesses just won't work that way. I mean, if you're selling like, you know, I don't know, like complex financial software to banks in New York, like you have to be there. Like probably never going to work out.
When it comes to revising your quotas and your commission, so let's say Q1 you set it at 50K, crushes it at 200K. Now the next quarter, do you say, okay, I understated that, and we're going to do 200K or 500K? Do you keep stretching it, and what's the relationship dynamic?
Yeah.
Feels like an abusive
for sure, art, not science. I mean, I think the great thing is if you set the quota at 50 and the person makes 200 and he gets a big commission check, you should be really happy, right? Like that's fantastic because you want to write big commission checks. You know, there's nothing that attracts good salespeople like hearing that their friends are making money. So I think that like, I don't think you want to explicitly let them over earn, but if they do, it'll have a big like recruiting halo effect, which will help a lot. So many startups will basically promise salespeople that, you know, they're going to make a lot of money. They might give them a big OTE, but then like no one's hitting their number. And I think especially the older salespeople are like very much onto that, right? And so a lot of times good people won't come until it's like very much proven that the model works and that people are making money. And so the savvy salespeople ask around, like, hey, like, you know, how much are you making? Like, how much are you, you know, ask the management team, like, how many people made it? How many people have you fired? And ask these like churn questions. So if you really want to avoid the scenario where you develop a reputation as a place where people can't make money. Because then it almost becomes self-fulfilling because you won't be able to hire good people because they'll sniff it out. So I think it's great. I guess it's great if they do make more. I think in the exact scenario you mentioned, you set the quota at 50. Let's say that was the ramped quota. Is that, because usually you want to give people a nice long ramp, like 2 quarters. For Kata we did 3. That was too much, but I'd probably raise it a little, see what happens the next. If they're beating it consistently, then it's easier to do it. If it was sort of a one-off, then yeah. For Kata, we have like 20 some engineers, around 40 quota carrying reps, 5 in sales management, and then obviously marketing and hardware and ops and things like that.
So I guess the point is like as engineering / product centric founders, like people are always, I knew we did this at Dropbox as well, like comparing growth of sales teams to engineering and product teams. But if your business is to sell, I don't think you should be afraid, especially if you experiment with this kind of scaling up sales based on quotas and how successful they're at meeting those quotas, which I think is a different way of thinking about scaling the sales team.
Yeah, I think you do want to be very thoughtful about the cultural implications. Like, I think there have been companies where there's sort of like the engineering culture always gets set first, and that sort of like then also becomes the sales culture. In my opinion, that's like sort of dangerous. They're just like different groups of people, and I mean maybe you can do it. But it's also possible that there's just like there's an overall company ethos and philosophy and culture, but there's like the salespeople are going to show up early, or they probably should be showing up early, and they're probably going to leave early too, and they're going to like go out hard on like a Wednesday night, and like that's fine, right? Like I don't think it's necessarily like a desired goal that like the company has a uniform culture throughout. I think people might disagree with that, but at least in my experience, it's totally fine. It's also good if the founders can kind of move between those cultures. Like, you're in the engineering area and you're like kind of having different conversations than if you're in the marketing area or the sales area. And it's, not everyone can like do that, but I think it's helpful if you think about that. Like, what does that really mean? That means like, okay, like when there's like a fun engineering outing or whatever, like you do that, and then when like the sales dudes do their happy hour, like you go to that too. Or at least you divide the responsibilities between the founders. That could be another way to do it. But I think it's not good if like, again, this is a very product and engineering centered, if you just say like, yeah, those guys are doing their thing. Like, you might get lucky, but it's way better if like at least one of you is like pretty close. Or like it's less risk. Yeah.
Because companies are sold to so often, there's sales fatigue sometimes, and so having the same kind of people sell to the same companies in the same way may lead to like a bad outcome. So do you think, firstly, do you think that's true?
No, I don't think that's true. I'm sorry. I just, I think, I think in a way, like for sales, it's hard to innovate. I mean, I think it's probably okay just to like, if people are used to buying in a certain way, like just do it better than what they're used to, but you don't have to like come up with something completely different. I think in consumer land, it's like a different story, but with B2B selling, yeah.
How important is it for a direct salesperson that you're hiring to have a Rolodex?
Not important, generally.
That's the other fantasy that a lot of people.
Yeah.
I definitely had that at Dropbox, but
Yeah. I think there might be cases where it is true. Like I could imagine, like if you're selling to military, maybe it's like all about who you know, and there's just not that many people, and it's all about like procurement contacts at the Pentagon or something. Like I don't like. I can imagine that there are like corner cases, but I think in general, people's Rolodexes get stale incredibly fast. And also, what is the probability that like the customers that you're going to find and sell to are exactly or even mostly overlapping with the customers that person sold to before? So as a result, I think it's rare. Also, a bit of a yellow flag if you're talking or interviewing a salesperson and they're like all about the Rolodex, and that's what their pitch to you is. I found a high correlation between that pitch and someone not being very good. So Rolodex means their contacts. They're like, hey, you know, you're selling, I don't know, like e-procurement software to e-commerce sites or something. I've sold a lot. I know the people at like all the big e-commerce sites, like you should hire me.
I had a question about how you describe marketing's role alongside sales, and in particular, you talked about just from the perspective of generating sales qualified leads. Did you experiment with like freemium or like self-service?
Yeah, this, you know, because these two businesses that we talked about have a hardware element, like freemium doesn't really play. We did try to Meraki with a systems management product, which is like mobile device management. And I don't think we knew what we were doing, so it totally didn't work. Freemium seems like a model that you can make work. I don't know that much. Like, I don't know anything that like you can't read about on the internet about that model.
Would you renew contracts like Meraki, I guess, you know, like you would, I don't know if you sold the devices and then would you, you know, like sell the same devices again after 2 years or whatever?
Yeah.
And if that was the case, would you have people to keep customers happy, right? Like, you know, you have the
kind of like a
hunters and
renewals
gatherers.
team. Renewals team. Yeah, so these two businesses are funny in that there is a hardware component and a licensing component. Now the license, you might have bought a 1-year license, but you like literally bolted the hardware to your ceiling. So like you're not taking it down. So like the renewal rates, it requires a lot less effort to renew that. Like very different from like if you're selling a, you know, whatever, a typical SaaS product and, you know, you're worried about like engagement. If not enough people are using it, then they're going to churn. And so you need to like get a customer success team in there to get people using it and then have a renewals team to make sure, you know, like, yes. So I think if you're selling that kind of product, like for sure, you need to think about like renewals and then figure out like, do I want the sales team that sold the deal originally to also be responsible for renewals, or do I want to have like a different team? What I've seen the most is that people have a separate renewals team and a separate customer success team. The customer success team makes sense to me because it's really hard to get the deal and you really want like all your effort into getting them and then like not having people worry about like, okay, now they signed the PO or the deal or whatever, now like we got to make them successful. So it makes sense to me to like create specialization there. So yeah. All right. Okay.
So you mentioned that inside sales is like a good place to begin. Would you recommend like ramping your marketing first in order to seed that pipeline? Like how
No,
to get that?
I would probably not. I think it's safe to just tell the salespeople they have to figure it out. If they're good, they will prospect their own deals. Now, a lot of times they're not good, but I think if they're hungry, motivated, like, and they're not getting enough from marketing, then the answer is like, well, you know, there's email, there's their phone, there's like LinkedIn, like there's like a gajillion sales tools now. Like, I mean, I feel like there's a new one every 2 months. There's outreach, there, you know, there's a lot of this stuff. So, you know, kind of get creative. And I really think that is important. I think you don't want to put your salespeople in a position where, like, again, they're just waiting for the leads to come in from some other source. Because a lot of times, like, that doesn't happen, right? Like, so, you know, they have to go hunt their own stuff. Also, a related question is, like, do you get SDRs or not? I feel like that's something I get a lot. I think both models work. I mean, I've seen good companies where they hire essentially, like, SDRs and salespeople in like a 1-to-1 ratio or 1-to-2 or 2-to-1. And then, you know, the pressure's on the SDRs to deliver enough leads. But generally that's, you know, sort of within the same organization or reports to the same person. It's a little different than having like 2 VPs that are both like kind of on the critical path. Cool. Well, thank you guys. It's been fun. Yeah.